I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking a lukewarm coffee, when the landline rang. Nobody calls the landline anymore these days, which has already caused me a slight discomfort. I looked at the display before answering and saw an unknown number. I thought about ignoring it, but something inside me insisted on answering. Little did I know that that call would break my life in two. Before her, I was just a discreet widow. Afterwards, I would become a problem to be eliminated. The voice on the other end presented itself as being from the bank where I have kept my account for more than 30 years. The tone was polite, almost automatic. He said my full name, confirmed my address, and then let out the sentence that made my hands start sweating. He informed me that my main account had been temporarily blocked by legal determination. I was silent, trying to understand if I had heard correctly. Blocked. Cool. Determination. None of these words suited me. I asked why, thinking it was some mistake, perhaps an administrative confusion. The attendant hesitated for a second, as if carefully choosing each word. I said there was a lawsuit underway questioning my ability to manage my own finances. My heart raced. Capacity? I pay my bills, I shop, I take care of the house, I read, I write, I think. At what point did someone decide that I was no longer capable? I felt a heat rise up my face, mixed with a shame that made no sense at all. I hadn't been warned of anything. No letter, no conversation, no prior explanation. Just that cold call, informing me that someone was speaking for me now. I asked who had requested it, but he replied that he could not provide details over the phone. He only said that I would receive guidance soon. The call ended, and the silence in the kitchen became deafening. I sat for a few minutes, staring at the wall in front of me, as if she could explain to me what was happening. I thought about my children. I thought of my oldest son, especially. Our relationship has never been easy, but I never imagined anything like this. He always said that I was getting confused, that I should rest more, that I didn't have to worry about certain things. At the time, I thought it was just impatience. Now, those phrases gained a frightening weight. I got up slowly and went to the living room window. The neighborhood was as always, quiet, predictable, almost boring. The same houses, the same cars, the same routines. It was hard to believe that while everything seemed normal on the outside, someone was trying to dismantle my life from the inside. I felt small, disoriented, as if I had lost the ground without warning. For the first time in many years, I felt afraid of the future. I went back to the table and tried to call the bank again, but I fell for endless transfers. No one seemed authorized to tell me anything concrete. Each answer was accompanied by a, "This is being analyzed," or "You will be informed." Informed when? After everything was decided? The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. I, who had always taken care of everything myself, was now treated like a confused child. It was then that I realized something even more disturbing. Someone had to provide detailed information about me. My data, my habits, my routine. Someone close. Someone who frequented my house, who sat at my table, who said he cared about me. The betrayal did not yet have a name, but it already had a form. And it hurt more than any financial threat. I tried to convince myself that it was just a misunderstanding, something that would be resolved quickly. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. No one blocks the account of a 63-year-old woman without a bigger plan behind it. That was not taken care of. It was control. And I was at the center of something that I still couldn't fully see. That night, lying in bed, I hardly slept. Every noise in the house seemed louder, every thought heavier. I mentally repeated a single question: who would do this to me? The answer, though I avoided admitting it, was beginning to form with painful clarity. And, without knowing it, at that moment, I was taking the first step of a transformation that I never imagined I would experience. The fact that you are here, choosing to hear this story so far, says a lot about your sensitivity to truths that almost no one wants to see. What comes next is not only about a woman betrayed by her own family, but about what happens when they try to take away our voice and our dignity. If you believe that stories like this need to keep being told, sign up. This is the most direct way to support and keep alive truths that can also be yours. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if something was about to happen. It wasn't ordinary anxiety, it was a weight in the chest, an uncomfortable intuition. I had barely finished making the bed when I heard firm knocks on the front door. They were not hasty or polite raids, they were official. I walked slowly down the hallway, feeling each step heavier than the last, as if my body knew that door shouldn't be opened. When I opened it, I found a man with a rigid posture, discreet uniform and neutral expression. He quickly identified himself and asked my full name. When I confirmed, he held out a brown envelope, saying that he needed to register the delivery. My hands trembled as I held that thick paper. The weight did not come from the envelope itself, but from what it represented. I signed mechanically, not quite understanding why I was being treated as someone who needed to be officially notified. I closed the door and leaned my back against it before I even opened the envelope. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. When I finally read the content, I felt my legs weaken. It was a formal request for an evaluation of my mental capacity. The words were there, cold, impersonal, describing me as someone possibly unable to manage his own life. I read and reread, hoping that the text would change, that my eyes would be mistaken. The document cited legal terms that I had never heard, mentioned reports, interviews and decisions that could be made without my consent. The cruelest thing was the tone. Everything was described as a protective procedure, almost a favor. Not a single line asked if I agreed. Not one line showed any doubt. It was as if my voice had already been discarded before I even knew I was on trial. I sat on the couch with the paper in my hands, trying to remember if I had done anything to justify it. Did I forget to pay any bills? No. Did I get lost on the street? Never. Did I confuse important dates? Just like anyone my age. Still, someone decided that these little signs were enough to strip me of the right to decide for myself. Injustice suffocated me more than fear. I continued reading until I reached the name of the person who had requested the evaluation. My stomach turned. There was the name of my own son. My blood. The child I raised, protected, defended. For a moment, I thought it was a grotesque mistake. Maybe someone had used his name without authorization. But, deep down, I already knew that it was no mistake. I remembered recent conversations, glances exchanged between him and his wife when I talked about money or the house. I remembered subtle comments about me being too tired or confused lately. Everything I had ignored for love now fell into place like pieces of a cruel puzzle. It was not a concern. It was preparation. The most painful thing was not the document itself, but the realization that it had been planned. Meetings, signatures, decisions. Everything done behind my back, while I still believed I was part of that family. I felt betrayed in a way that no words could explain. It wasn't just about money or control. It was about erasing me while I was still alive. I folded the paper with excessive care, as if it would explode if I was abrupt. I kept it in my bag, even though I was at home, as if I needed to keep it close to prove to myself that it was real. I walked around the house observing every piece of furniture, every photograph, every memory. All that could no longer be mine. My story could be rewritten by others. At that moment, something changed inside me. The fear was still there, but it no longer came alone. There was also a silent flame, a profound refusal to accept that fate. They could call me whatever they wanted, but I knew who I was. And for the first time since the call from the bank, I decided that I would not be silent. It took me 2 days to get up the courage to call my son. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of what she would hear. When I finally dialed the number, my hands were cold and my voice came out lower than I would have liked. He answered too quickly, as if he was waiting. I asked if we could talk. He sighed before I even finished the sentence, and that sigh told me everything I needed to know. I was direct. I asked about the document, about the bank, about the mental evaluation. There was a short silence on the other end of the line, followed by a rehearsed response, too calm to be honest. He said that I was exaggerating, that it was just a preventive procedure, something common. He said he was doing it for my own good. That sentence pierced me like a blade. It was the same one he wore as a child, when he wanted to convince me to accept something I didn't want. I tried to argue, to say that no one had spoken to me before, that I was fine, that it was unnecessary. He replied that I didn't realize my own limitations, and that this was part of the problem. Hearing my own son say that I was unaware of my lucidity was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. I felt diminished, childish, as if my entire story had been erased with a single sentence. I asked who else was involved. He hesitated, then admitted that he had talked to his wife, a friend-appointed lawyer, and a doctor who had never examined me in person. Meetings had taken place without me. Decisions had been made in my name. Meanwhile, I was at home, watering plants, paying bills, living as usual. The normality of my routine contrasted with the gravity of what they were plotting. When I mentioned the house, there was another pause. He said that no one wanted to take anything away from me, but that maybe it would be better to get things sorted before something happened to me. That confirmed my deepest suspicions. It wasn't just about care. It was about control, equity, convenience. It was about making sure everything was in the right hands when I couldn't react anymore. My voice began to crack, not from weakness, but from pent-up anger. I asked him if he really believed that I wasn't capable of deciding for myself. He replied that he believed I needed help. Help I didn't ask for. Help that was accompanied by loss of rights. Help that treated me as an obstacle, not as a mother. Deep down, I still hoped that he would back down, that he would say that he had made a mistake, that all this had gone too far. But his tone only became firmer, more distant, more bureaucratic. He spoke as someone who had already convinced himself of his own version of the story. And maybe it was easier for him to believe I was confused than to admit I was cheating on myself. I hung up the phone before I started crying. I didn't want to give him that satisfaction. I sat in silence, feeling a dull pain in my chest, like an anticipated morning. I wasn't just losing my autonomy. She was losing a son, even though he was still alive. Trust, once broken in this way, is not easily fixed. I spent the rest of the day reliving moments from his childhood, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. Where did I fail? Where did I fail to realize who he was becoming? These questions tortured me, even though I knew that no answer would change what was happening now. The betrayal was already in motion. That night, in front of the bathroom mirror, I watched my own face for long minutes. I saw wrinkles, gray hair, marks of time. But I didn't see incapacity. I saw a woman tired, yes, hurt, yes, but fully aware. And there, looking at myself, I made a silent promise: if they wanted to paint me as someone fragile and manipulable, they would be surprised by who I was about to become. The day after the conversation with my son, I woke up with a sense of urgency that wouldn't let me breathe properly. It was as if time had sped up without warning me, as if every hour now had doubled weight. I walked through the house with another look, noticing details that had always been there, but that I never feared losing. The specific creak of the floor in the hallway, the old mark on the kitchen wall, the familiar smell of the clothes closet. All of that, suddenly, seemed temporary. I sat down at the table in the living room and scattered the papers I had received. I read each line again, more carefully than before. It was there that I understood the real extent of the threat. If I were considered legally incompetent, I would lose control of the house, the accounts, the simplest day-to-day decisions. Someone could decide where I would live, how I would spend my money, and even who could visit me. That was not just a legal formality. It was the erasure of a lifetime. The house I was sitting in was not just a real estate. It was there that I raised my children, that I took care of my husband in the last years of illness, that I cried alone after the burial. Each room held a part of my story, and the thought that someone could take it away from me with a signature caused me physical pain. It was as if they were trying to pull out my roots while I was still breathing. The cruelest thing was to realize that everything was being done with an appearance of legality and care. No one shouted, no one threatened openly. It was a silent, polished, almost elegant stroke. They didn't say, "Let's take your house away," they said, "Let's ensure your well-being." They didn't say, "You're not in charge of anything anymore," they said, "We'll help you rest." The manipulation was between the lines. I started thinking about my grandson. How much I feared that he would be used as a bargaining chip, away from me under the pretext of protection. I already imagined controlled visits, fixed times, disapproving looks if I dared to disagree. The thought of losing not only my independence, but also the bond with him, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't bear. I remembered all the times I heard that I should sell the house, move to something smaller, more suitable for my age. I always replied that it wasn't time yet, that I liked my life as it was. Now, I understood that those suggestions were never innocent. They were rehearsals. Preparation. A gentle push in the direction they wanted. I got up and walked to the bedroom, opening drawers, touching objects, holding photographs. There was something deeply unfair about having to prove that I deserved to continue being the owner of my own life. I had not committed any crime. He had not lost his reason. Still, she was treated as someone who needed to be contained, managed, controlled. For a few minutes, I thought about giving up. To accept all that just to avoid conflict, not to confront my own son in public. The emotional exhaustion was enormous. But soon this idea caused me immediate revulsion. If I gave in now, I would be confirming the version they created of me. He would be collaborating with the annulment itself. It was then that I realized that fear was slowly beginning to turn into something different. It wasn't courage yet, but it was indignation. A profound refusal to be treated as a disposable burden. I could be alone, but I wasn't empty. There was still clarity, memory, and will within me. That afternoon, I closed all the windows in the house and sat down again at the table, pen and paper. If they thought I was incapable, they would have to prove it. And for the first time since it all began, I decided that I would not only defend myself, I would understand exactly what they were trying to hide, and why. After that quiet decision not to back down, I began to pay attention to things that I had previously ignored. Small details, loose comments, changes in behavior that now took on another meaning. It was as if I was reviewing my own life with a sharper, and at the same time, more painful, lens. The more I thought, the more I realized that none of this had come out of nowhere. I remembered the first time my son asked to help organize my documents. At the time, I thought it was practical. He seemed interested, careful, worried. Now, that memory gave me goosebumps. He knew exactly where I kept everything, he knew my passwords, my habits, my routines. It was not too difficult for him to put together a dossier on me. I had delivered the tools myself. I started to review old statements, contracts, forgotten folders in the back of the closet. Nothing screamed illegality at first glance, but there were gaps. Transfers that I didn't remember authorizing, decisions made at times when I was emotionally fragile, shortly after my husband's death. I trusted too much at that time. I was too vulnerable to question anything. My daughter-in-law's behavior also began to make sense. Always polite, always distant. He never raised his voice, but always suggested, led, directed conversations. She was the one who insisted that I was tired, that maybe I was forgetting things, that I should save myself. Now I saw, those sentences were not innocent comments. They were seeds planted with care. I started writing everything down in a notebook. Dates, phrases, situations that once seemed insignificant. I didn't know yet what it would be for, but I felt that I needed to organize my own narrative before others continued writing for me. Each note was a small act of resistance, a way of reaffirming my lucidity. I also realized how certain stories had been distorted over time. Things that I had consciously decided to come to be counted as lapses, impulses, mistakes. It was subtle, but constant. The repetition of these versions created an image of me that did not correspond to reality, but that, from being said so much, began to seem true to those who listened. There was a moment when I wondered if I wasn't exaggerating myself now. If I wasn't seeing conspiracy where there was only concern badly expressed. But it was enough to remember the call from the bank, the official document, the confident tone with which my son spoke of decisions that excluded me, to dispel any doubt. That was not clumsy care. It was a plan in progress. The most disturbing thing was to realize that everything had been built with patience. No direct attacks, no confrontations. Just a succession of small nudges, strategic comments, carefully made records. When I realized it, they were already questioning my ability based on a narrative that had been fed for years. I started to observe the conversations more closely. The pauses, the exchanged looks, the calculated silences. I was no longer just a target, I was also a witness. And that changed everything. For the first time, they didn't know exactly how much I had realized. That gave me a quiet advantage. At the end of that day, I closed the notebook and took a deep breath. I didn't yet have all the answers, but I had something equally important. The certainty that I wasn't crazy, confused, or deceived. There was something wrong, deeply wrong, and I was getting closer and closer to understanding what they were trying to hide. And when this truth came to light, no one would come out unscathed. That week, I decided to tinker with something I'd avoided for a long time, my husband's boxes. Since his death, I have hardly touched anything that went beyond the essentials. There was a kind of silent pact with myself not to rummage in the past. But now I felt that the past was pulling me by the arm, demanding to be heard. If there was a hidden truth, it was there. I opened the boxes carefully, sitting on the floor of the guest room. Yellowed papers, old folders, envelopes with dates that took me back in time. At first, everything seemed normal, statements, receipts, old contracts. But as I progressed, I began to notice something strange. Some documents were incomplete, others had notes that I had never seen before. And there were values that simply did not add up. My heart raced when I found a folder marked with only one letter. Inside it, there were financial records from years ago, right from the period when my husband started to get sick. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, signatures that weren't mine, decisions made when I was too emotionally exhausted to question anything. That was no carelessness. It was concealment. I sat up on the bed, holding those papers as if they were evidence of a silent crime. I remembered how, at that time, my son had offered to take care of everything, saying that I needed to rest, that he would take care of the bureaucratic part. I accepted, grateful. Now I realized that this was the moment when I lost control without realizing it. The more I read, the more the story redrew itself before my eyes. Part of the assets never reached me. Part of it had been diverted, reorganized, diluted in decisions that I never consciously approved. The heritage I believed I knew was just a convenient version of reality. And that version held up the power they were now trying to exert over me. I felt a mixture of nausea and deep sadness. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that trusting had been my biggest mistake. People who claimed to protect me made decisions while I mourned the death of the man with whom I shared my life. They used my pain as an opportunity. And now they tried to use my age as a justification. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts. It all made sense now. The haste to declare myself incapable. The fear that I would start asking questions. The need to silence myself legally. If I were found incompetent, I could never contest those decisions. I could never reopen that past. It was there that I felt something different from the indignation that had been growing in me. It was clarity. A cold, almost frightening clarity. They weren't just underestimating me. They were afraid. Fear that I would connect the dots, fear that I would regain control of my own story. I kept the documents again, but not as someone who hides something, as someone who preserves evidence. I put everything in a bag that I started to keep always close. Those papers were more than old records. They were the key to understanding what was happening now. And, perhaps, the only way to truly defend myself. That night, I hardly slept, but not out of fear. My mind worked non-stop, reviewing memories, conversations, decisions. I was no longer just a woman being attacked. I was someone who finally saw the full game. And that completely changed the position I was in. At dawn, I prepared a strong coffee and sat down at the table with a decision made. It was not enough to prove that I was lucid. I needed to prove why they wanted me so badly not to go. And whatever the cost, that truth buried for years would not be hidden any longer. After the discovery of the documents, something changed in the way people started to treat me. It was not immediate, nor explicit. It was gradual, almost imperceptible to anyone looking from the outside. But I felt it. Conversations ceased when I entered the room. Decisions were communicated after they were made. Questions that I was asked before were now answered by others, as if my presence was only decorative. My son started showing up unannounced, always with some pretext. He said he was checking if everything was okay, but his eyes wandered around the house as if evaluating a property for sale. He opened cabinets, commented on objects out of place, suggested changes. Each gesture was loaded with a false delicacy that only made everything more offensive. I was treated as someone who needed to be monitored. The worst thing was to realize how my daughter-in-law took a central role in all this. She spoke for me in phone calls, explained my difficulties to others, smiled while diminishing my capabilities. Always polite, always calm. Her cruelty was not in her harsh words, but in the naturalness with which she replaced me. As if I were already absent, even though I was there. My grandson started to come less. When he came, there was always an adult around, watching our conversations, controlling the time. I saw in his eyes a silent confusion, as if he was being taught to see myself differently. That broke me inside. Nothing hurts more than being transformed into someone dangerous in the eyes of those you love. I started to feel ashamed inside my own home. Shame to ask, shame to disagree, shame to exist. It was a humiliation that did not scream, but corroded. At night, I wondered how it was possible that all this was happening without anyone from the outside noticing. The world went on normally, while I was erased little by little. There was a day when I heard my son on the phone, in the kitchen, talking about me as if I wasn't just a few feet away. He said that I was unstable, that it was only a matter of time before everything was legally resolved. Legally. That word echoed in my head like a sentence. I was no longer a mother. It was an ongoing process. I thought about confronting them, screaming, exposing everything right there. But something inside me told me to wait. The humiliation, as painful as it was, also showed me how far they were willing to go. And the more comfortable they felt, the more mistakes they made. I needed to observe, record, keep. I began to feel alone in a way I had never experienced before. It was not the absence of people, but the absence of recognition. I was surrounded, but invisible. Still, at the bottom of this loneliness, something remained intact, my awareness of who I was. They could question anything but that. It was at this stage that I understood that humiliation was part of the plan. If I felt small enough, maybe I would give up fighting. If I doubted myself, the rest would come naturally. But instead of breaking me, it started to harden something inside me. Each gesture of contempt was silently transformed into fuel. That night, I wrote in my notebook a simple sentence: "They think they've already won." As I closed the pen, I felt a strange calm. Those who believe they have already won usually let their guard down. And I was starting to understand exactly how to use that to my advantage. I always thought that the neighbor next door was just too curious. Those who know everyone's schedule, who water the plants by observing the street, who notice when something goes out of standard. I never imagined that attentive look, which sometimes bothered me, would become one of the few anchors I would have at that moment. She was the one who knocked on my door on a silent afternoon, with a different expression on her face. She asked if I was okay. The question was simple, but there was something in the tone that made me answer honestly. I told him that I was going through a difficult time, without going into details. Even so, she seemed to understand more than I said. He commented that he had seen the strange movement in my house, the frequent visits, the heavy atmosphere. He said that something there didn't seem to be cared for, it looked like surveillance. We sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in days I felt that someone was listening to me without analyzing me, without measuring myself, without judging me. I told him about the document, about my son, about the mental evaluation. I expected to see pity or doubt on her face, but I saw only attention. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said something that changed everything: it wasn't right, and I wasn't imagining things. She told me that she worked for many years as a legal secretary before retiring. She was not a lawyer, but she knew well the workings of processes, requests for interdiction, maneuvers disguised as care. He said he had seen similar situations, almost always involving money and family. That confirmed what I feared, but it also brought me a strange relief. I was neither alone nor wrong. She asked to see the documents. He observed each page calmly, pointing out details that I would never have noticed on my own. Dates out of order, terms used too generically, absence of essential signatures. Small flaws, but real flaws. For the first time since the beginning of everything, I felt that there were cracks in that structure that seemed so solid against me. She was the one who suggested that I not confront my son at that time. He said that hasty confrontations only strengthen those who believe they are in control. The best way, according to her, was to prepare myself, have information, have professional support, have a strategy. That word echoed within me like a call. Strategy. Not emotion. Not despair. Strategy. She then mentioned a lawyer she had known for a long time. An experienced man, known for not accepting ready-made versions and for distrusting very well-aligned stories. He said he could make a call for me, just for an initial conversation. I hesitated. Part of me still felt ashamed to expose all that. But another part, stronger now, knew that I could no longer face it alone. When she left, I sat for a long time, staring at the empty cup in front of me. Something had changed. For the first time, I didn't just feel like I was reacting to the attacks. I was starting to take a stand. Her presence had broken the isolation that weakened me. That night, I slept a little better. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because a real possibility of confrontation had arisen. A witness. An ally. Someone who saw what was happening and didn't pretend normality. This, in itself, was already a form of resistance. Before going to sleep, I wrote in my notebook another short sentence. They don't know that now I'm no longer alone. As I closed my eyes, I felt something new form inside me. It was not naive hope. It was preparation. And that made all the difference. I entered the lawyer's office with my heart racing, but my posture upright. She was no longer the confused woman they tried to paint. Still, that formal environment, with bright walls and controlled silence, aroused an old nervousness. I knew that my story would be put to the test, not by emotion, but by logic. And that scared me as much as it strengthened me. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a direct look, without pity, without haste. He asked me to tell everything from the beginning. Not only recent events, but also the family context, the death of my husband, the relationship with my son. I spoke for almost an hour without being interrupted. For the first time in a long time, I felt that my words carried weight. When I finished, he was silent for a few seconds, flipping through the documents I had taken. I prepared myself to hear what I had heard before, that it was complicated, that maybe my son was just worried. But he didn't say any of that. He only said that story was not closing, that there was too much haste, too many failures, and, above all, too many interests. He explained, calmly, that interdiction requests usually follow a strict pattern. In my case, there were shortcuts. The process had been initiated without adequate evaluations, based on subjective reports, coming from people directly interested in my assets. That was not preventive care. It was a clear attempt at legal control. I felt a mixture of relief and indignation. Relief to finally hear someone confirm my suspicions. Outrage at realizing how far my own son was willing to go. The lawyer told me that it would not be an easy path, that facing family in court is never simple. But he also made it clear that I had something powerful on my side, verifiable lucidity and documents that raised serious doubts. We talked about my husband's inheritance. When I mentioned the old papers and the strange transfers, his gaze changed. He asked to see everything more carefully. He asked for copies, dates, contexts. I said that past could be the key to understanding my family's current despair. And that, if confirmed, would completely change the game. I left the office with a strange feeling of tiredness and strength at the same time. The fear still existed, but now it was accompanied by direction. I knew what I needed to do, not to react impulsively, not to confront without strategy, not to give signs that I was ready. The more underrated I looked, the better. Over the next few days, I followed my routine with calculated calm. He answered phone calls, answered messages, pretended to agree with harmless suggestions. Inside, however, I was alert. He wrote everything down, recorded dates, kept messages. Every detail could become important later on. I noticed that my son began to act more confidently, as if he believed the process was under control. He spoke of solving everything soon, of organizing my future. His haste now made sense. He needed me to be silenced before certain questions officially began to arise. In the evenings, I mentally reviewed everything I had learned. It wasn't just a battle for my autonomy. It was a dispute for the truth. And for the first time since the beginning of it all, I knew I wasn't at a disadvantage. They had a plan. But I had something much more dangerous for them, evidence and time. Before going to sleep, I wrote one more sentence in my notebook, with a steady hand. They think I don't understand the game. And that's exactly what's going to defeat them. I closed the notebook knowing that the confrontation was approaching. And this time, I would be ready. After the conversation with the lawyer, something inside me was organized. It was not a complete relief, nor a sudden burst of courage. It was colder than that. A quiet clarity. For the first time since it all began, I didn't wake up just reacting to what they did to me. I woke up with a plan, albeit incomplete, but mine. I started to observe everything with another eye. Every call from my son, every message from my daughter-in-law, every suggestion disguised as care. I answered calmly, sometimes even with partial agreement. I let them believe that I was tired, confused, dependent. Not out of weakness, but out of strategy. The more comfortable they felt, the less careful they became. I started to record everything with method. Schedules, exact words, version changes. I no longer relied solely on memory, I turned my routine into a living archive. It gave me a sense of control that I hadn't felt in months. I didn't need to confront anyone now. I needed to understand their rhythm, anticipate movements, predict reactions. I also changed my emotional posture. I stopped trying to justify myself all the time. I stopped explaining who I was. Anyone who needs to explain too much is already at a disadvantage. I started to talk less, listen more. The woman who was once seen as anxious and sensitive now became silent, restrained, almost indifferent. And that confused them. There was a moment when my son commented, half laughing, that I seemed calmer. I said that maybe all that was doing me good. I smiled. A short, controlled smile. Inside, I understood that he had made a mistake. Calm was not acceptance. It was preparation. He confused silence with surrender. Meanwhile, the lawyer continued to analyze the old documents. Each new conversation with him reinforced something I already felt, that attempt to declare myself incapable had not been born out of nowhere. It was a desperate move to end an unresolved story. And the closer we got to the origin, the more fragile their version became. I started to take care of myself in an almost disciplined way. He slept better, ate attentively, walked every day. Not because someone had sent me, but because I needed to be whole. Each simple gesture became a silent affirmation of my autonomy. I was not a clinical case. I was a woman at war. I also had to face something difficult, abandoning the need for approval. For a long time, I tried to be the understanding mother, the available grandmother, the easy woman to deal with. Now, I understood that this had put me exactly in that position. Being too nice had made me too convenient. And I was no longer willing to be convenient. At times, fear still appeared. Especially at night, when the silence of the house seemed heavier. But now he didn't paralyze me. Fear served as a warning, not a break. I listened to him, adjusted my pace, and moved on. There was no more room for naivety. It was thus, almost without realizing it, that I stopped seeing myself as a victim. I was still being attacked, yes. But I no longer felt helpless. My every move now had intention. Each silence had meaning. And while they believed I was weakening, I was growing stronger in ways they could never have imagined. On the last page of my notebook, I wrote something different from the previous sentences. It was not a warning or a statement. It was a decision. I'm not just going to survive this. I'm going to turn the tables on it. And at that moment, I knew that there was no turning back. The confirmation came on a rainy afternoon, when the lawyer called me asking me to come to the office urgently. His tone was not alarmist, but there was a contained gravity that made me understand that something important had been found. During the journey, I felt a constant butterflies in my stomach, as if my body knew that this conversation would change everything. And it did. He spread the documents on the table with almost ceremonial care. He pointed out dates, values, connections that I would never have connected alone. The old transfers, made while my husband was sick, had been redirected to a structure that directly benefited my son. Not in a crude way, but cleverly planned. Cool enough to go unnoticed, until now. My son had anticipated the inheritance. He did not wait for his father's death, nor did he respect his mother's mourning. He used signed powers of attorney in moments of emotional fragility, reorganized assets, created layers of legal protection. All this while telling me not to worry, to rest, to trust. The word confidence echoed in my mind with a bitter taste. The lawyer explained that if I started questioning those decisions officially, the whole house of cards could collapse. And that's where it all fell into place. The attempt to declare myself legally incompetent was not the beginning of the coup. It was the end. The final move to ensure that I could never contest anything. It wasn't just about controlling myself now, but about silencing me forever. I felt a deep pain, different from anger. It was the pain of understanding that betrayal had been building for years, with patience, calculation, and coldness. My son did not act on impulse. He planned. And, perhaps the hardest thing to accept, it relied on time, my good faith and my tendency to believe the best in people. I asked if that could be proven. The lawyer replied that he did, but that it would require courage. Exposing that past would mean bringing everything to light, family, reputations, old decisions. Nothing would be unscathed. There would be no return to normal after that. He looked me in the eye and said that I needed to decide how far I was willing to go. I thought of his grandson. I thought of the woman I had been until then. I thought about the humiliation, the fear, the imposed silence. It wasn't just a question of money. It was a question of dignity. If I backed down now, I would be validating everything they did to me. He would be allowing the lie to become the official truth. I took a deep breath and said I would move on. Not for revenge, but for justice. The lawyer nodded, as if he was already expecting that answer. He said that, from then on, the game would change level. That there would be resistance, attempts to reach an agreement, emotional pressure. That they would not easily retreat. I said I already imagined it. I left the office with the feeling of carrying a weight and a force at the same time. The truth, when it finally reveals itself, does not bring immediate peace. It brings responsibility. I now knew exactly why they wanted to erase me. And that made it impossible to pretend that nothing was happening. That night, I sat alone in the dark room and cried. I cried for the mother I was, for the trust one gave, for the love that was not enough to stop the betrayal. But at the end of the crying, something settled inside me. The doubt was over. It wasn't paranoia. It was not an exaggeration. It was real. Before going to sleep, I wrote in my notebook the longest sentence so far. They tried to declare me unable to hide what they did when I still trusted. As I closed the notebook, I felt a cold and definitive certainty. Confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. He was marked. And it would be public. This is the hardest part to tell, because by saying it out loud, I relive losses that never fully healed. Sharing this moment means exposing not only the betrayal, but the emotional cost of almost losing my own identity. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths hurt more when they are silent. So I ask you, sign up, not as support, but as a gesture of preservation, so that voices like this are not erased when they dare to speak. The day of the hearing arrived with a strange, almost respectful silence. I woke up before the alarm clock, feeling the weight of what was to come, but without that chaotic anxiety of the previous days. There was nervousness, yes, but also a firmness that I wouldn't recognize in myself months before. I dressed carefully, not to look frail or to look too strong. I wanted to look exactly who I was. As I entered the building, I felt all the eyes on me, even though I didn't know if they were real or the result of tension. My son was already there, sitting next to his wife, talking quietly to their lawyer. When our eyes met, he quickly deviated. That told me more than any words. For the first time, I wasn't the one who seemed out of place. I sat next to my lawyer, feeling the cold texture of the chair under my hands. I observed the room, formal, impersonal, built for life-changing decisions in a few sentences. It was there that they would try to define who I was. Not as a mother, not as a woman, but as a report. The idea still revolted me, but I didn't let it show. As the hearing began, I listened carefully to every word said about me. They talked about my age, the fact that I live alone, carefully exaggerated episodes of confusion. Each sentence was said with a tone of rehearsed concern. I kept my gaze steady, breathing calmly, while inside I remembered every bill paid, every decision made, every day lived with full awareness. The time came when I was asked to speak. I stood up slowly, feeling my heart beating strongly, but without trembling. I spoke clearly, without haste, without excessive emotion. I didn't try to prove that I was perfect. I just described my routine, my decisions, my life. Sometimes the simplest truth is the hardest to dispute. As I spoke, I noticed subtle changes in the room. Looks that were once indifferent were now attentive. Faster annotations. Longer pauses before questions. I wasn't begging for credibility. I was demonstrating. And this bothered those who had built an opposite narrative. My lawyer then began to present the technical points. He questioned the origin of the request, the absence of independent evaluations, the unusual haste of the process. Each question was precise, surgical. My son started to move in his chair. The daughter-in-law kept her smile tense, but her intertwined fingers betrayed nervousness. When the old documents began to be mentioned, I felt the air in the room change. We haven't gone into detail yet, but the simple reference to inheritance and past decisions was enough to expose the real conflict of interest. This was no longer a hearing about care. It was about control, money, and silence. There was a moment when my son tried to talk to me directly, saying that all that could be solved in the family. That comment was interrupted firmly. For the first time, someone set clear boundaries. We were not mother and son. We were part of a lawsuit. And that made him uncomfortable. The hearing was suspended for a few minutes for preliminary analysis. While we waited, I sat quietly, feeling a strange calm. I had done everything I could so far. I hadn't diminished or exploded. I had occupied my space. Regardless of the result, something had already changed. When they resumed, it was clear that this story would not be resolved quickly. There were too many questions, too many inconsistencies. What was supposed to be a simple procedure had become something much bigger. And as I left the room that day, I knew they would still try to resist. But control was no longer in their hands. The turnaround did not come in the form of a dramatic speech, but a technical detail that almost went unnoticed. It was the lawyer who explained it to me, days after the hearing, with a calm that contrasted with the impact of the information. One of the documents used to justify the request for interdiction had been filed irregularly. The date did not match. The order of the acts made no sense. And that, in the legal world, was everything. He told me that this mistake seemed small, but it dismantled the entire narrative. The request to evaluate my capacity had been made even before any report existed. In other words, the conclusion came before the analysis. That wasn't just a rush. It was documented bad faith. Someone had already decided the outcome and was just trying to build the path later. When I understood this, I felt a mixture of shock and relief. They had been careful for years, but they relied too much on the idea that I wouldn't notice anything. They bet on my age, on my silence, on my supposed fragility. And it was precisely this excessive confidence that made them make mistakes. For the first time, the game was turned sideways. At the next hearing, this detail was exposed with surgical clarity. My lawyer presented the correct chronological sequence, comparing dates, signatures, and official records. The room fell silent. There was no possible interpretation. The attempt to declare myself incapable had been built backwards. First the decision, then the justification. I watched my son as it was presented. His face lost color. The confident posture of the previous meetings gave way to visible discomfort. He tried to explain, correct, relativize. He said that he had been misguided, that everything was done with good intentions. But good intentions do not explain such convenient mistakes. It was then that the inheritance returned to the table, now in a direct way. The link between the attempted interdiction and the fear of reopening old decisions was evident. That was no longer a suspicion of mine. It was a logical line laid out before all. The silence that followed was heavy, almost embarrassing. At that moment, I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't a triumph. It was closure. The doubt had been officially buried. I no longer needed to prove who I was. Now, they were the ones who needed to explain what they did. And this reversal of roles was definitive. The responsible authority asked direct questions, bluntly. She questioned why I had never been consulted. Why independent evaluations were not made. Why there was so much urgency. Each evasive answer only deepened the problem. What began as an attempt at protection now looked more and more like abuse. When the session ended, the request for interdiction was formally suspended. Not postponed. Suspended. That word echoed inside me strongly. They no longer had control of the process. And for the first time since the beginning of everything, the scales were clearly tilted in my side. As I left the room, I felt my legs weak, but my head held high. I had crossed the most dangerous point. Not because I won alone, but because I resisted long enough for the truth to come out. And this, more than any sentence, was the greatest proof of my lucidity. That night, I sat quietly in the living room and looked around. Nothing had changed physically. But everything was different. They tried to erase me using the law. They were unmasked by the law itself. And I knew that the end of that story was near, even if it was not a simple ending. The final decision came a few weeks later, unceremoniously, without applause. A formal statement confirming that I retained my full legal capacity and that the claim against me had been found to be unfounded. I read those lines carefully, sitting at the same table where it had all begun. It was the confirmation of victory, but it did not bring euphoria. It brought a deep, almost silent tiredness. I had won, but nothing would ever be the same again. The house was still mine, my accounts were under my control, my autonomy had been preserved. Still, the price of that victory was high. The relationship with my son was broken in a way that did not admit of simple repairs. There was no more room for innocent conversations or spontaneous trust. He tried to call me a few days after the decision. I didn't answer. Not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. Some wounds need distance so they don't turn into infection. I knew that if I did, I would hear poorly formulated excuses or attempts to minimize what was done. And I didn't need that anymore. My daughter-in-law never got in touch. Her silence said it all. People who act in the shadows rarely know how to deal with light. I didn't miss it. He felt only a resigned sadness, as if accepting that some relationships exist only as long as they are convenient. My grandson remained the hardest part of it all. The visits became sporadic, full of care and formality. I hugged him tightly. He didn't speak ill of anyone. I learned that dignity is also knowing what not to say. Over time, I began to reorganize my life. Not just documents and bills, but routines, priorities, limits. I hired an accountant, reviewed everything that could be reviewed. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I owed no one anything but the truth. I started to walk more around the neighborhood, talk to new people, accept invitations that I had previously refused. It wasn't an escape, it was reconstruction. I wasn't trying to forget what happened. I was learning to live with it without allowing it to define who I was. There were nights when I cried alone, remembering the son I raised and the family I thought I had. These tears no longer came from humiliation, but from mourning. I mourned for something that died without the right to say goodbye. And interestingly, accepting this gave me more peace than fighting it. The legal victory gave me back control, but it was the emotional clarity that gave me back my strength. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone now. The doubt had been buried along with the lie. And that was enough. I realized that there was something powerful about not seeking a perfect ending. Life rarely offers that. What it offers, sometimes, is the chance to get out of an injustice in one piece. And I left, harder, perhaps. More careful. But entirely. That night, I sat on the porch watching the sky darken. I took a deep breath and felt something close to peace. It was not full happiness. It was something more realistic, more solid. I had been tested, betrayed, and nearly erased. And yet, it was there. Standing. Owner of my story. After it was all officially over, I realized that the biggest challenge was not taking back control of my life, but learning to live with the woman I had become. I was no longer the same as before. There was something in me that wouldn't go back to the previous state, and it took me a while to accept that. Not as a loss, but as a transformation. Some battles leave no visible scars, but change the entire structure of those who survive. I started to make decisions with more firmness and fewer explanations. I no longer felt the need to justify every choice, every limit. I learned that clarity doesn't have to be accompanied by guilt. If before I tried to keep the peace at any cost, now I understood that true peace requires well-defined borders. And I was finally willing to defend them. I reorganized my assets, my routine, and my contacts. Narrow the circle, but strengthen the ties that remained. People who were by my side without questioning me, without diminishing me, without trying to decide for me. I found that true support doesn't make a sound, he sustains in silence. It completely changed the way I related to the world. I also started to take care of my mind with the same zeal that I always had with my home. Allow me to talk about what I have experienced, but without transforming pain into identity. I was not the woman who was almost interdicted. I was the woman who faced a deep betrayal and didn't give in. The difference between these two narratives was everything. My son was still distant. Sometimes, we exchanged brief, neutral, almost protocol messages. There was no full reconciliation, and perhaps there never would be. It hurt to accept this, but I learned that maturity is also recognizing when love needs to exist at a distance so as not to become destructive. I loved him, but I didn't trust him anymore. And that was a definite limit. The bond with my grandson remained delicate, rebuilt in small gestures. A smile, a drawing, a short conversation. It wasn't ideal, but it was real. And at that point in my life, I had learned to respect what was possible, not just what I wanted. That was also strength. I started to get involved in simple but meaningful projects. Classes, readings, meetings. Nothing grandiose. Nothing to prove anything to anyone. Just things that reminded me daily of who I was outside of that conflict. I didn't have to survive anymore, I could live again, even if differently. Sometimes, someone asked me how I managed to face all that. I never responded with speeches. It only said that I had reached a point where being silent hurt more than fighting. When dignity is threatened, fear ceases to be the biggest problem. Surrender becomes. Today, when I walk through the house, I no longer see it with the fear of losing it. I see her as a witness. Every wall, every corner knows what I faced inside. And it reminds me, every day, that no one has the right to erase me as long as I'm alive and conscious. I didn't become bitter, but I became solid. I didn't become cold, but I became selective. I learned that fragility is not the opposite of strength, it is often the starting point of it. And I was exactly that, underestimated, pressured, almost annulled, until I decide not to be anymore. If someone looks at me now and still sees a frail woman, it doesn't bother me anymore. I know who I am. I survived the most intimate betrayal there is. And those who go through this, and remain standing, do not need to prove anything else to anyone. If something you've heard here has touched you, sharing this video can do more than you think. This story is not just about one woman, but about patterns that silence, control, and delegitimize people every day. Send it to someone who needs to hear this right now, because sharing is also an act of protection, alertness, and collective courage. I'll stay here reading every comment, really. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching this, and what about this story has left you? Reading your words matters to me more than you think.